Assalamu alaikum. A very good morning. It is the second day of lockdown, and to me it appears that ages have gone and a day is not over. But this is for the safety, security, and well being for all of us, and I hope it must be very hard on you young people that you must be trying your best to keep yourself safe and everybody else safe. I wish you the best. Today we will talk in ancient Indian history about the polity of that era, of that age. Under polity there are many topics like what was the status of a king, and then revenue, justice, and army. So let's today talk about their idea of a king and what status kings in ancient India enjoyed. The classical age was not politically very smooth, because at that point of time, king was absolute, and even he had kind of a quasi-divine powers, as he was the one to give a last word for it. Tribal republics were key players on the Indian political arena in the Vedic age. But over the centuries, they had been steadily losing ground to kingdoms, and now, around the middle of the first millennium, they almost totally disappeared. Territorial monarchies now replace tribal republics everywhere in India. But the kingdoms and empires of the classical age, unlike the tightly integrated Mauryan Empire, were loosely structured and administered. And you will see a change here, that the absolute powers of kings were being compromised. Mauryan system of governance was something of an aberration in Indian history and was heavily influenced by Greco-Persian model. It did not survive the fall of the empire. As soon as the Mauryan Empire fell, this idea of a king and this system of a ruling got changed. Indian society in the classical age had become highly complex, divided into innumerable castes, guilds, and regional communities, each with its own inviolable customs and practices which kings had to respect. At least there is one thing, that the king was respecting his people, his riaya. And the governments of the classical age were mostly minimum governments. And now it was not the government that regulated the socio-economics order, but castes and guilds, which functioned virtually independent of government. By this time, there was considerable erosion even of the primary law enforcement function of the government, as caste and guilds assumed a major part of the responsibility for maintaining routine law and order and for administering justice. So we see that in the classical age, the common people, as per their interest in professions, they were becoming more powerful. For the common people, those bodies, those guilds, constituted the government, and they had little to do with the king's rule. And it suited the king also, because these self-regulating bodies took over many of his responsibilities, as it lightened his administrative burden without lowering his prestige. You can call it an ideal situation. An Indian polity by this time remained feudal in characteristics. But unlike the formal, systematic, and hierarchical structured European feudalism, Indian feudalism was a casual and irregular system, the structure of which varied considerably from region to region. And the vassals in Indian kingdom were mostly conquered chieftains given autonomy by the king. And the king's rule did not acknowledge the king's authority, but they did not normally intrude into the vassal's domain. If we talk a comparison between this Indian and the European feudal system was in the pattern of land ownership. In Europe, the kingdom was the monarchy's property, which he partitioned and assigned to his chief nobles in return for dues and services. And the nobles, in turn, partitioned their fiefdom into estates and gave them to lesser nobles on similar terms. So it was like polity was being divided from king to vassals and from vassals to chieftains. This classical period tells us one more thing, that although the king often assigned to his chief officers tracts of land in lieu of pay, which also got carried in Mughal times, what was assigned were only the revenue and other dues from the tract, nor the land itself. Mughals continued this also. The land never belonged to people. The king could not in any case transfer the ownership, for the land belonged to the cultivators, not to him. However, kings did not own vast personal estates in their kingdom. Isn't it strange for us to understand? We always have an idea of a monarch of unlimited powers and unlimited holdings. The weakness of the classical Indian polity was particularly evident in the organization of the empires of that age, which were loose and like a group of vassals, rulers under the overlordship of an emperor. Even small kingdoms were loosely organized at this time. And if we just refer back to the Gupta Empire, it was better integrated than these kingdoms, but not very much more so, though the Guptas directly ruled over the core area of the empire in the Gangetic plain. Beyond that, their empire consisted of the domains of tributary kings. Though they acknowledged the emperor as the dominant ruler of the land and took care to maintain good relations with him. There was a good amount of decentralization even in the core area of the Gupta Empire, and all its administrative divisions from provinces down to villages enjoyed substantial autonomy. Reminds us of our own age, where we wish to have such kind of a system. The devolution of powers and responsibilities of the government to castes, guilds, and local bodies resulted in an incredible diversity of laws and proliferation of the centers of power in the kingdom. The advantage of this was the socio-economic institutions in India endured virtually unaffected by the fate of kings and dynasties. They remained safe, or the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires, and they provided Indian society with a stability and continuity not found in any other civilization. This is a very big point, that this system saved and maintained the economic welfare of the society. The decentralized form of government was, on the whole, beneficial to the people, for it needs them to save them from the tyranny of kings, and it made the government more humane. as power rested mostly with the persons and institutions that were close to the people and not with a distant ruler and an unresponsive bureaucracy. Looks like a very ideal democracy there. The people are numerous and happy, writes the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian about the condition in the early 5th century. And he writes, the families are not entered in registers and the people are not subjected to forced labor. Very progressive thinking. But as we reach the first millennium CE, the beginning of it, the grand imperial enterprise that began with the kingdoms in Bihar in the 6th century BCE and culminated in the establishment of the Mauryan Empire 2 centuries later had become a distant memory. The political norm in India during the 14th century, from the fall of the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BC to the establishment of Delhi Sultanate in the 12th century CE, was small kingdoms and dynasties, almost ephemeral and weak government. But there was a paradox. As kingdoms grew small in size and limited in power, their kings fancifully took to puffing themselves up, and with even pretty chieftains pretending to be great emperors, rulers of the India, even of the entire world. Power does give people this kind of conceit, that they think there is no one else except them. These grandiose pretensions of the kings, considered with certain fundamental changes in the status and role of kings in India. In the early Aryan tribal polity, the king was only a patriarch chieftain accountable to the tribal assemblies which appointed him. He had no hereditary rights to chieftainship, though in many cases chieftainship in practice remained in the same family. And it helped in evolving a society, and functions became specialized. Kingship became hereditary as a rule, as did the other professions. And all this led to a reversal of the relationship between the king and the people, and it now came to be held that the people belonged to the king instead of the king belonging to the people, as it had been earlier. Hindu sages considered monarchy as the absolute prerequisite for the effective functioning of society. Mahabharata says, in kingless lands no rain falls, no gods visit. But this idea that without a king there will be no security for family property, and Ramayana says something like this too. But let's ask a question, that how did kingship originate? How it all began? In Mahabharata and other Hindu texts, the general answer to this puzzle is to assert that the king, unlike the common people, is a special being created by the gods to save mankind from anarchy. The views of the Hindu lawgivers were probably influenced by the practice of Central Asian rulers who dominated North India in the early centuries of Common Era. The Central Asians generally deified their kings after their death, sometimes even during their lifetime, and dedicated temples to them. The Indian ideal of monarchy was paternalistic, and it was essential for the king, to his own self-interest, to be benevolent and efficient and thus win the goodwill of the subjects. Righteous rule has the same merit as the performance of great Vedic sacrifices, and all the texts enjoin kings to be virtuous and just, but they also recognized that the common norm of human conduct do not apply to them. And we come to understand that the Indian king was, in theory, a constitutional monarch. He had no other authority than to govern according to the laws, established customs, or given in sacred texts and law books. Indian kings were always in inimical relationship with their neighbors. They had to be, because universally they held the view in India was that king's neighbors were his natural and inevitable adversaries. So his own survival depended upon it. Indian kings were usually eager patrons of literature and arts, as we saw in Gupta period and Maurya period, as that was considered a mark of nobility and refinement. They were particularly generous towards poets, not necessarily because of their enthusiasm for literature, but because it was mainly through the writings of poets that the reputation of kings was broadcast and their memory perpetuated.